Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us. We're very excited to have the world cooperate with us by having a G20 in Argentina just before we had a dinner and have a Canada-US-Mexico agreement in that order signed there and have China and the United States meet. So, you know, it's great when people help you out that way. I'm going to invite up successively in order each of the three panelists. We're going to have a little brief discussion and then we'll do it all together. I'm going to dispense with some of the formalities and just move a little bit into the informalities. I think I am, Mike. That's good. So first up, we're going to have Luiza Savage, who is the editorial director of cross-platform content at POLITICO. She's right up there. And importantly, among other things, has been the driving force behind Politico Pro Canada. If you haven't, I'm not here to advertise for Politico Pro Canada. I have no financial stake in it, unfortunately, but I have been reading it for the last 2 weeks, kind of obsessively, and I recommend people have a look at it. I've known Luiza since she was a journalist here in Canada 20 years ago when she went to the States, and she and I have been talking about trade, competitiveness, fiscal issues, et cetera, off and on for many years. So, Luiza, come on up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
Oh,
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a long time.
Even, yeah. So, so eventually, but not now, but eventually that will be my seat. I'm just saying that, okay? So that's good.
Sorry.
Okay, you've had a long day. And it started in New York with an event, a Politico event, where at the Canadian consulate in New York, and you had Finance Minister Morneau there. But just generally, coming off this weekend, what would you say the sense was among the people you were hanging out with today on, you know, where Canada stands now, how the Canada-U.S. relationship stands, what the weekend has meant?
That's a big question. So yes, we did sit down with the finance minister this morning, and really what we talked about was the Trump effect. We talked about how this entire fiscal update was shaped really by the guy in the White House, whether it was corporate tax, business investment taxes, incentives, whether it was a plan to really change regulation in Canada to reinvigorate this long attempted and long failed attempt to harmonize regulations with the biggest trading partner. We talked about what is it actually going to take to diversify trade away from the United States, something that we've been talking about for decades and just not succeeding at. I was on a conversation with Kevin Lynch a week ago in Vancouver, and he had some slides up showing that we're at the same percentage of non-US exports that we were 10 years ago. And I feel like this conversation has been going on and on. So we talked a little bit about that. I think, we asked him toward the end of the conversation, what is it like dealing with this administration now that you've gone through the USMCA, you've gone through all this? And they seem to just be very pragmatic, very just taking it day by day, and Trump seems to be very transactional. Like one day he's tweeting about how this is the worst deal ever, and then they tweak it, and suddenly he's having a call talking about how it's the best deal ever, right?
You think there's a method to that madness?
I think there's a lot of showmanship. There's no question. I mean, he's the king of showmanship if he's the king of anything. So, he'll spank you in public, and then he'll get on the phone with you and gush. I mean, it's very hard in that environment to know, what is his bottom line and what is just rhetoric, because it can change on a dime.
Right. So tell me, you've done some polling recently at Politico on attitudes towards trade in the United States. And so when we get away from the daily hurly-burly, what do those fundamentals look like?
Sure. So this was a question, what do Americans really think about trade? We did this polling in the run-up to the midterms, and we were doing very in-depth polling in certain battleground states, which we thought would be very important to the outcomes. And in particular, we were looking at Ohio when it came to trade, and we did some very in-depth questionnaires about this. And what we found was people in Ohio, Rust Belt state, quote unquote, really thought trade was great for their economy. The numbers were in the 60s and 70s when you asked them about trade. They were very positive on it. The thing is, when you then ask them, well, what are you concerned about when you go into the voting booth? I mean, trade was, I think it was number 10 or 11. Like it's not what they're voting on. This wasn't the NAFTA election in the United States. The number one issue was healthcare. Like it wasn't even bubbling up to the surface. And I'd had conversations with, farm and agricultural lobbyists in Washington who were telling me how furious they were with what Trump was doing to the agricultural sector, how they were being hammered with retaliatory trade measures from around the world. And that he would go into these communities and farmers would tell him, we're so upset about the trade stuff, but we support our president. And I think that's the thing that people don't quite understand is that Trump's support among his base is still very solid, even in the rural agricultural areas. And so he felt that he had plenty of room to maneuver. And the other thing I think people sometimes miss is how bipartisan the concerns around China are, particularly around intellectual property, around currency manipulation. I was telling you, Ed, that when I first came to Washington in 2003, I worked for a small New York startup called the New York Sun. And one of my jobs was to cover the New York congressional delegation. And I remember one of the very first things I wrote about was Senator Schumer putting out press releases, introducing legislation all about China's currency manipulation. So this is something that some of the Democrats really do care about as well. So the question, I think, about the Trump administration is, are they going out and isolating themselves in terms of their attitudes toward China, or are they really leading on it, and will other countries follow?
Well, let's go ... Stay tuned, because we'll come back to that question in the wider discussion in a moment.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Luiza. So next up is Ali Velshi. Look, a lot of you know Ali Velshi famously from CNN and Al Jazeera and MSNBC, but peak Ali Velshi occurred in the CTV bureau in Ottawa a number of years ago. Maybe you don't remember him on TV because he didn't get on TV that much, actually. A bit of a waste of talent, wasn't it? And Ali, among other things, his work, he's been nominated for 3 Emmy Awards and works for, I suppose, the counterinsurgency journalistically or something of that sort?
They call it.
An MSNBC. So look, when we were seated at the table and Brian was interviewing Ambassador McNaughton, and they were talking at one point about the tenor of the administration,
right.
The character of the administration, and you kind of leaned over and said, well, I guess he has to be very diplomatic. So
right.
How do you see this?
Look, I respect that diplomats have to be diplomats, and that Canadians need to not think about burning that bridge to the United States. But I think it's important to think about this administration, particularly the executive branch, as being populated by 3 kinds of people aside from the president. One are sycophants who have no business being in public office or being in politics. The second are people who don't agree with the president but think it's their calling to be there. And the third are, and I don't care because I've said this on TV, so I don't mind saying it in public, the third are dim bulbs. There are just people who don't have the nuance and understanding appropriate to deal with issues of trade, which are highly complex, issues of immigration, which are highly complex, and if Americans were told the real story, they'd realize they don't have a replacement rate that allows them to stop legal immigration, let alone what they call illegal immigration, with climate, with social policy, with public policy, with healthcare. As Luiza said, healthcare is the most important thing in this election. So this administration is lacking in nuance, and there are probably some people in there who are quite qualified to provide good answers. But if you look at some of the president's closest advisors on the economy, like Larry Kudlow or Kevin Hassett, they don't believe in any of this trade war nonsense.
So they're in the sycophantic class.
Well, no, I think they actually think they're doing something for the country. I think there's a sense that people have in both of our countries that when you offer yourself up for public service, that's important. That's a calling. I think some people are missing the fact that this is going to be permanently damaging to their careers and isn't helpful.
Okay, one of the things you've also spent a lot of time talking about over the last couple of years is well, let's say the cultural wars, for lack of a better word, cultural politics. And I think a lot of people spend time wondering, is culture drive economics? Does economics drive culture? You're pretty certain about what's
Economics
happening,
driving
right?
culture, and I think it's global, right? So people who talk about Trump this and Trump that, the wave is global. It has been since the Arab Spring. It has been all the way through Eastern Europe and then Western Europe, into Brexit and into the United States, and then back to Western Europe. I think there are two issues. This is the first time in 70 or 80 years where being in the middle class doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a constant battle and a danger of sliding back into a different class. And I think the second thing to keep in mind is that we as journalists or academics or economists or politicians or elites have for 40 or 50 years been lying to people about how they will benefit from increased trade. So the fact that it increases GDP growth is true. The fact that it increases corporate profitability and share prices is true. The fact that that somehow trickles down to workers has been proven to be 100% wrong in a country that is not prepared to undertake the things that will allow the worker to share in those benefits, which we have not done particularly well in Canada, and we've done particularly badly in the United States.
That anger in the belly, if you will, that has driven U.S. politics, is it dissipating in any way as with unemployment as low as it is,
Weird, right?
with wage growth, not completely weird because there's been no wage growth until recently.
Correct. And the wage growth is small. It doesn't make sense, right? From the time you and I, we worked in the same office, by the way, the same building here when I was in Ottawa. And back then, if somebody had told us there was 5% unemployment, we'd have thought that full employment. At 3.7, to be seeing
David Dodge is here, and we could talk about Nehru. Right?
So he would know better than I would. So I'm going to stop talking because you really know about this stuff. But when their wages are not increasing, when they're working multiple jobs, and again, the aggravation in the United States is the number of jobs that don't come with health care. So the degree to which your job insecurity relates to your life insecurity, a little bit different in Canada and in countries that provide health care properly. So though I think you're seeing, until we get to the nuances and we get to the underlying problems, Luiza's point was really right. We are sending a reporter to farms and manufacturing facilities across the country. They're all mad about the countervailing tariffs, and most of them are still supporting the president. They are on razor-thin margins. If you're a farmer in America, you can't afford to support the president for 2 years on this thing. But for this year, they are supporting him. People are that angry that they will let their self-interest go, their economic self-interest go, for some justice that they feel has escaped them.
Okay, well, why don't you have a seat, and we will get back to that conversation. I guess, David, if I get Nehru, I used to sort of obsessively stalk David Dodge when he was Deputy Minister of Finance, and a reporting trick I learned is he went out every day at a certain time to smoke his pipe. So if you just walked around the block the same time he was walking around the block, you could learn about the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment and things of that sort, things that were very, very useful to a reporter in Ottawa, trust me. So finally, coming up and joining us is Janice Stein, who is famous for many things, among them particularly, I think, as founder of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, which she headed from 1998 to 2014. And Janice has a slew of real degrees, honorary degrees, and honors like the Molson Prize by the Canada Council for the outstanding contribution to public debate. So we're going to have more outstanding contribution to public debate. And I should say perhaps that in about 8 or 9 years ago, I worked on a big report for the Canadian International Council, and Janice was like my thesis advisor. So every 2 weeks we would go in, and she would rip it to shreds, and it turned out much, much better for us. So,
now let me just tell you, we have David Dodge in Toronto now.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Where do we start? Let's start with strategic terms, since you're a strategic thinker and a leader in our strategic thinking. So now we have this agreement. It's signed, not sealed and delivered, but signed. How fundamental is this?
I actually think we're at a moment of a big shift in the Canada-US relationship. Leave aside all the pyrotechnics and the fireworks that have gone on. And let me just say, huge shout out to David McNaughton and to the incredible team of people that got us where we are now. I did not think that we would get where we are now. But where are we now? I think there's really 2 or 3 basic things. One, we have moved to managed trade, and that's a big difference from really 30 years of an increasing push to free trade. And when you read the agreement, it is just sprinkled right through it. We can talk about that later. Secondly, this is a really weird agreement that President Trump signed, because when you read it, you see all new institutions that are laced through this agreement that are really inconsistent with the rhetoric. So we have a series of multilateral committees now between Canada, the United States, and Mexico on intellectual property rights, on macroeconomics, which are actually deepening the managed trade. And the third big change, and I think this is probably the biggest one, the riskiest one for me to talk about because we're at an early stage, we are in what I call a rebordering of the world. The United States is one of those big reborderers, and this is, in fact, a regional agreement where for everybody who's in business, the supply chains will become more and more regional and less global as we thicken up borders.
So people used to talk about perimeter as a security concept, and nobody could ever sell a perimeter. But you think essentially we've got an economic rebordering, we're inside America, and the implications for our own maneuvering room, our own sovereignty, or what?
Well, as a very well-known former Deputy Minister of Finance said the other day in Toronto, we are a small country. And when big powers draw lines, you don't like that world. You wish it weren't there. You didn't design it, but you have to make choices.
Okay. Well, I don't
Is that
know.
fair?
I don't know if that's. I don't know if that makes me feel comfortable or not.
It's not designed to do that.
No, apparently not designed to make us comfortable.
No.
Well, let's start on that point because you say that the negotiators did very well, and I think that's fair enough. But they didn't have an easy hand to play. They didn't have points of leverage, and they were dealing with a partner who no longer is benign in any way towards Canada. So what are we going to do not to be in this situation perpetually?
I think that's a really important question that faces Canadians. To a person, the negotiators who survived this, and you probably met some of them, this was a 13-month ordeal. Every one of them walked out and said, and thumped the table, we will never find ourselves in this position again. Well, they gave us a bridge, which is a huge gift, our team of talented people. They gave us a 15, 16-year bridge, we hope, if all goes well. But we have to walk across the bridge. And we have to...
It's a bridge to where?
Well, it's a bridge to a different kind of economy than the one we've known, frankly. When I talk about the car industry, and I come from Ontario, so you can imagine, I gotta watch what I say. But the car industry is already a digital industry. A car is a really fancy computer wearing a very elegant steel dress. That's where we are now in the car industry. Just imagine where we will be 5 years from now. So this country has to build a digital economy, and the key asset in a digital economy, of course, intellectual property matters, but what really matters is big data at scale. And we're small, and it's going to be tough for us to scale up to the level of the big ones. So we have to leverage partnerships, and we have to be really smart about who we partner with.
That's a uniquely nuanced and sophisticated look at our economic future, and one which I agree with. But there are two things to keep in mind. This whole trade nonsense started with intellectual property concerns. And
what trade nonsense?
This whole world that we're in. And that would have been...
That actually started 2,000 years ago.
That would have been, but in this particular instance, with China and intellectual property, that would have been something the world would have united around to solve. And China would have figured out that its time on this one was running out, but everybody needs China, and China needs everybody. We could have had a very sophisticated trade discussion for the last 2 years, but we didn't. And the second thing is, to your very eloquent description of a car being a sophisticated computer in a steel dress, United States trade policy is being designed around 20th century technologies, right? We are protecting industries that we would have been better to figure out forms of retraining or trade adjustment, which, by the way, they have laws for. We have laws for that in Canada and in the United States, and we don't do that well. It's the one thing virtually no culture, no developed culture has figured out. So not only have we got 3.7% unemployment in the United States, but we technically have more jobs than we have people looking for them. That's not entirely accurate.
Well, this is why we have low unemployment and high economic anxiety.
So
right?
Can you imagine if all of these resources that we've been spending on these unnecessary parts of our trade battles would have been spent figuring out how to get these coal workers? You talked to David about opioid addiction. These are all connected to our economic failures. There haven't been a ton of economic failures, but if we would just have actually started to address the ones we had, we could be having a very different discussion today.
Luiza, just weigh in on this. We're going to go back to the present in a couple of minutes, but as you see the evolution of the Canada-U.S. relationship and trade, and you look ahead, where do you see this going? And will the kind of drama that we've had be a regular part of the process?
Yes. I want to just add on to something that Ali said. I sort of disagree with what you said, that U.S. trade policy is all about the old industries. That's part of it. That's the populist part of it. That's the messaging of it. But it's really about IP. I mean, this is U.S. trade policy right now is saying all these multilateral institutions that were supposed to enfold China, that were supposed to elevate China, that were supposed to make China this emerging, huge, dominant player in the world, follow the rules, have failed. And so, rightly or wrongly, now we, America, while we still have might, we're going to go out and unilaterally push them to do the things that the world community has been giving lip service to. Now, that might fail, but I think we have to acknowledge it. This isn't just about coal miners. This is about intellectual property, too. So I guess the question in my mind is, will America go it alone? Will they choose to go it alone? Will they be forced to go it alone on this? Or are there countries going to find some way of working together on these goals? Because absolutely, I mean, you're seeing the investments that Canada's making in AI. I mean, that there's definitely some recognition that this is the future. But you can't have that if you're trying to export. It's fine if you're exporting oil to China, great, that's fine. But if you're trying to export software and they're taking that intellectual property from you, stealing it, or forcing you to go into joint ventures with their own state-run companies, that's not fair trade. And I think there are people within the US government who maybe fall into one or more of the categories that Ali set out, who feel very strongly about that. So
That's your bipartisan consensus remark
well,
earlier, right?
Maybe bipartisan, maybe not, but I do think it's the serious part of the critique that's happening in Washington. And when you take that and you couple it with not just the economic critique, but if you look at the National Defense Strategy, if you sit down and read it, what Jim Mattis signed off on in this administration, it's all about China.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
this
you wanna
is
jump in on
this
China
is the
here.
backdrop.
I really don't. I agree. I agree. Let me say this. Trump is the consequence, not the cause. And we waste too much time talking about him, frankly. Because all the issues that we've talked about were there in the Obama administration as well. There was deep concern about China. And
that was the whole TPP effect, right?
Absolutely.
Attempt,
TPP really was a response to a very, very Trans-Pacific Partnership. Was a response to a very deep concern about China and around issues of IP, intellectual property, technology transfer, unfair trading practices. And by the way, the United States is not alone. The European Union shares those concerns, and I think many Canadians share those concerns. Now, what's bizarre about the strategy makes no sense. If you want to build a coalition to push China on these kinds of issues, you don't brutalize Canada and Mexico for 13 months, and as soon as you're finished doing that, go ahead and brutalize Japan and the European Union, and then expect everybody to line up, as you just said, around a broader initiative.
If I could share a quote that we had from an analyst in Europe when we were reporting on the section of the USMCA that says, the non-market economy clause, if you do anything with China, you have to tell us, we can kick you out of the agreement, et cetera. So we had commentary from analysts in Asia, and we asked some in Europe, and they said, oh, Europe would never go for this, and here's what they called it, Finlandization.
But it's actually, interestingly enough, it's in the framework agreement with Japan, the very same clause, just slightly different words, and it's in the framework agreement with the European Union that they've agreed to now as they begin their negotiations. So this is a US strategy with every single one of its trading partners, and I think this is what we mean.
I guess the question, if we stay with China, US and Canada's need to diversify and put those together, I guess I'd have a couple of questions. One would be, yes, let's get a fair trading system. Is that really what the goal is, or is there a bigger strategic rivalry question here? And Janice, as a historian of foreign policy gone bad, what is the chance of strategic blunder that does lead us in directions that we don't want to go, as opposed to directions that seem quite clear to us? So I'm going to start with you.
With me?
Yeah, and we'll move around. We'll go around.
I think so. I worry when I look at this constellation. I worry because you've got overlapping fault lines here. When there are issues, if you layer them on one on top of the other, that's when you start to get into dangerous territory. So we have really serious trade issues between China and the United States that are not new. On top of that, we will have, if we don't have them already, we're going to have big technology issues between the United States and China. China walls off its 1.4 billion people and goes into this with an enormous advantage because it can scale up big data in a way that is just unimaginable to the rest of us. And if we're thinking about the futures of big digital companies, the goal is this capacity to scale data. China has walled itself off, and that's going to build tensions. And then thirdly, of course, we see navies playing really stupid, dangerous games now in the South China Sea, where an American warship and a Chinese warship were 45 yards apart. And frankly, the American warship just, verved in order to avoid a collision. So is there a possibility that an incident could escalate, people miscalculate? Sure there is, under these kinds of circumstances.
Ali, is China an issue where MSNBC and Fox meet?
That's interesting. That's interesting, because when Luiza said she sort of disagreed, and I was saying, I don't think we're disagreeing on what the importance of the issue is. The fact is, in the last election, trade didn't surface as much of an issue to most people, which is why the people who are affected by it are so angry, the farmers and the manufacturing workers, because they'd like it to be issue number one, but it's not. Immigration is not issue number one. Healthcare is issue number one. So the problem here is the nuanced understanding of how the world needs to deal with China in particular, and how some trade experts who may still be in this administration wish to deal with it, is not what's communicated by this administration to a third, or whatever you want to call it, of Americans. It is trade. It is unfair trade practices that get where President Trump can lash out on against allies, when in fact both of the things that Janice and Luiza are talking about are the things that are the most important, should have been the most important, and should have been central to the discussion, in which case MSNBC and Fox would be on the same side of this issue. I don't think we're not. I mean, I think the ultimate issue is no CEO or Treasury Minister or Trade Secretary I've ever spoken to said that we were in negotiations with the United States and boy, did we get the better of them. It's just not true what Donald Trump says about how everybody's been taking advantage of the United States. But what he's taking advantage of is the complexities where I talk to Canadians who will often talk to me about trade dispute mechanisms or chapter numbers. I don't talk to any Americans who say that, not even American farmers, not American workers. So the things that you have to know in Canada because you have an 800-pound gorilla next to you, you do not have to know in America. You just have to know that
that's
people
part
are
of being a
cheating
middle power. You need
Right.
rules to
But
hang
so,
on
so
to.
to
You
the
don't have
extent
power.
that there are people trying to fix an actual problem that you two have articulated really seriously and really well, that is not the articulated goal of the U.S. administration, because if it were, they wouldn't get elected. That's the same kind of people who talk about fixing your infrastructure and cleaning up your climate. Donald Trump ain't that guy. He's going to talk about people taking advantage of you and screwing you over on your milk exports. And that's what the problem is.
Yeah, just for the record, trade is no longer the most destructive force with respect to employment. There was a period after China joined the WTO, and the estimates are, America bled 1 million jobs. That is no longer the case,
Yes.
Ali. What is really the biggest issue is technology.
Right.
And that's homegrown in the United States.
But it's the same underlying sentiment of anger against the people
Right.
who made me lose my job or are responsible for me not increasing my income, or the fact that my town is bankrupt. That's the problem. It's not articulated as a solution.
But that's not an American problem.
Correct.
Look at France. Look
Correct.
what's going on in Paris
It's a global
right
problem.
now.
Right.
It's in Brazil, right? It's
Yep.
a global problem
Absolutely right.
that we're dealing
It's
with.
just that when America has a problem, it exports it to everyone else.
No, it was late to the game on this one.
Yeah. Well, let's use this as an entry point to politics, and let's go back. The midterms were less than a month ago. I think they're still being interpreted and reinterpreted in some ways. There's been, I think, a lot of dispute in the interpretation. The Democrats, there was a blue wave, there wasn't, they didn't get the Senate, et cetera. Let me start with you. How do you read what happened in the midterms, and who's up and who's down, and what messages should we take away from that?
Oh, I think it was a tremendous election for Democrats. I think everyone knew going into it that the map for the Senate was incredibly difficult for Democrats, just given which seats were up for re-election, which ones were in deep red states, which ones Democrats didn't have a chance of getting. And I do believe the next Senate election is also going to be difficult for Democrats. I think they're going to have to wait until the one after, when they have a better map. So just given what happened in the House, that was clearly a sign of mobilization by Democrats, of energy by Democrats, and I think all of us here in the room know that like one of the biggest banner headlines out of that election was like the huge increase of women in the House of Representatives and also in the Senate and in governors' mansions around the country. It was a really significant election. I mean, to put it in context, the last couple election cycles, women had been stuck at 20% of the House and Senate. So the last election, everyone was so focused on Hillary Clinton, glass ceiling, blah, blah, blah. What I was so struck by was that women didn't move the needle at all on Capitol Hill. So I actually oversaw a big project at POLITICO, a data analysis over the past year, tracking women candidates to see, okay, great, there's so many of them running. Are they all running for the same seat in the same blue district? Are they all going to cancel each other out? So it was quite striking to see this incredible increase in women's representation. The thing that really concerns me about that outcome is we didn't see it for the Republicans. And in fact, I think some of the numbers went down in the Republican caucus, which is just like a very bad outcome for society in general. You want to have women on both sides of the aisle. But yeah, I thought it was a very strong showing by Democrats. It doesn't mean anything about 2020, in my view. I think when Trump says, I wasn't on the ballot, I think that's correct. I think there are people who would turn out for Trump. I think he does have a very strong following with his base, and they weren't necessarily motivated to turn out in the midterms the way that Democrats were, who were very angry with this administration. So I'm not sure that it can just extrapolate to 2020, and it's going to be a really interesting.
Except perhaps in turnout, which of course the congressional
Well, but what I'm
election, the
saying is
midterms were
I
amazing
think Donald
turnout.
Trump can also juice turnout. So I think it's going to be a really, really interesting presidential race.
So you've been interested in the face of the new Congress and what that means and what that tells us America. What do you?
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, on every level. First of all, the remarkable increase. Again, the caveat here is on the Democratic side. The Republican class picture looks exactly the same, if not less diverse than it did before. The Democratic class picture is remarkable. Women, gays, refugees, immigrants, Muslims, Native Americans, a bisexual senator. I remember talking on TV about how the governor of Colorado is the first openly gay governor of Colorado, and somebody said, why didn't you say he was Jewish? It's like, okay, he's Jewish and he's the openly gay. Like, I didn't think I thought being the first openly gay senator was like a sort of a bigger achievement in Colorado, but whatever. The point is, that's great. I will say that I'm kind of alarmed that after the disastrous 2 years of this administration, that's all that happened. In other words, I think it's conceivable, as Luiza said, that Donald Trump does bring a lot of people out, and there are people who didn't come out because he wasn't on the ballot, and that Donald Trump may fairly win another election in the United States. Now, that's fine. This is not a partisan comment. This is a report card comment. That to have performed the way he has for 2 years, where he said, I can take a gun and shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose support, it's kind of true, right? His base has stopped deteriorating. It doesn't matter what new news you get. It doesn't actually affect that base. For all sorts of, in my opinion, economic reasons that we've talked about, those people don't have somewhere else to go to. And Democrats aren't giving them someone else to go to either. Yeah. It's great in your local candidacy, but who's running for president?
But the suburbs of Philadelphia, where you sometimes
that is the most famous place. Philadelphia, suburban women are the most famous people in America.
But that's moved, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is that move material? Is it significant?
Well, it was also redistricting.
Right.
Was part of it.
So Pennsylvania had a good amount of redistricting, which affected things. But I also think that's interesting on the margins, right? What we're really looking for is that the people who came out to vote for Donald Trump and who will again in 2020, plus the people who came out and voted in this election to take American turnout numbers to the highest they've been in a midterm election, they're not the same people. Those are not people who are going to switch, right? It's not movement. So now my fear is this is becoming like post-war Italy, right? Where it's going to be faction against faction, dialogue is disappearing, and we start to have swings, and then we're going to rename the airports and the main streets every time there's an election. So I'm not sure we're solving the problem.
But I would just add to that in terms of something that's really good for Democrats in terms of looking forward to 2020 was they made huge strides in places that were key to Trump's victory. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, like all those places where Trump actually won the Electoral College vote. They did really well. They won governorships. Yep. They increased their delegation. So that was a sign that they actually could do well.
Just again, to think past the 2020 election, because who knows? I think all three of us would probably say at this point, who knows? And you talked about this, Ali, earlier when you said we've done a terrible job in most of the Democratic world on retraining, right? We've actually not been truthful with people. We've used words like adjustment.
Would you say on the fundamental question underneath, I think what Ali was saying is can unity be reconstituted in some way? So if you look at charts of asking people if their basic identification is Republican, Democrat, or Independent, you've seen Independent shrink to almost nothing, and you see a much more polarized thing. And you can see this happening geographically, you can see it happening urban, rural, you can see it happening by education level.
But it's everywhere.
Okay.
That's right. It's not all, and this is, I think,
the big point. It's not a U.S. phenomenon.
It's not a U.S. phenomenon.
Is it coming to Canada soon? Or is it already here?
I think it's tempered a little bit. Again, and I see everything through lenses of economics, so pardon me if it sounds the same. But I think it's tempered in places where your job insecurity doesn't relate to the fact that you think you're going bankrupt. I think it's tempered in places where other services are offered. The desperation in America, if you are out of work, is not just that you'll be out of work for a long time, and not just that you can't sell your house because the factory's gone, but now your family's subject to opioid addiction.
I wish I could believe that.
But those are not the Trump voters, actually. The Trump voters are not unemployed, right? That's a mistake we make. They're not unemployed.
But they're stuck.
No, but so then let's talk about that for a minute, because it's a global issue in the democratic world. So you see polarization now in France. You see in Germany that the big center parties are losing.
I think Germany was the example I was going to say, because Germany has the best social labor system in the world, but the center is also hollow.
The center is shrinking and the fringes are growing. So if you think about that in the context of a period, 15, 20, 25 years ahead of us now, where technology will be really disruptive. And there's no point in kidding ourselves. We are in for disruptive times economically and socially. It's not easy then to say, how do we unify people in the face of disruption, which creates economic insecurity, political insecurity, and what do people do then? And this is certainly something we've learned in the last 100 years. They scapegoat people. And that's fundamentally what we're seeing all over Europe and the United States. It has not come here yet to that degree, but fingers crossed.
The oil
fingers
industry,
crossed.
GM, you know,
Can I
people
just say,
adjusting
I
these.
don't want us to overstate economic anxiety as a driver for Trump voters. I think that's part of the picture. But I think the culture wars you were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
that's huge. When we did a really interesting discussion at the Republican National Convention last time around with a group of technologists for the different Republican primary candidates. And we had Trump's campaign technologist there too. And he said, you know, the way we pick off Trump voters when we're looking for who to advertise to is we collect data about their psychological profile. And the key thing we're looking for, and this is how he phrased it, he said, we're looking for Old Testament voters.
Yeah.
It was like there's black and there's white, there's no shades of gray.
Yeah.
And that was what they thought was how they targeted their people. It wasn't economic anxiety, it was a worldview.
Yeah.
And no other primary candidate was putting that forward except for Trump.
Let me make a politically incorrect comment. Do you think it's smugness that infuriates so many people?
Make your
Smugness.
schmucky.
Smugness.
Smugness.
You mean on the part of politicians and
Yeah,
elites?
on the part of
Yeah.
elites who are
But
smug,
so-
condescending, and
But
actually
how
at
does that
times
explain,
disrespect the people who support their security.
how does it explain, though, the fact that what we're seeing in America, to your point that we're late to the party about technology and automation and outsourcing, how does it explain the fact that we've seen this sort of thing happen across Western Europe? Go to Germany. Take the example of Germany, where immigration is the motivator on these people. Germany is a remarkable success story in immigration and integration. It's just worked. They integrated. Eastern Germany integration was more serious than Turks and Arabs going into Germany. They figured it out, and yet that becomes the thing that angers them. So I don't know how I separate the weaponization of culture from an underlying economic anxiety, because that's the commonality, right?
Yeah, so you blame it on the other, et cetera. But I just wanted to add one more layer to the Trump voter, just so people have like a full picture. So there's the culture war piece, there's the mentality piece. But I know a lot of Trump voters who are very well off and very successful. Yeah. And guess what? Trump delivered for them. He delivered a huge tax cut. He delivered an entire generation of conservative judges. He has delivered time and again for evangelicals. People are like, oh, why do evangelicals like Trump? He's been divorced, he's had affairs, da-da-da. No, well, he has delivered for them on a lot of well, not just judges, but a lot of very specific policy things that they wanted. So they see him as a guy, they just say, whatever, his Twitter, whatever, we don't care. He's delivered. So I think there are different segments of his voting base that are actually quite happy with him, notwithstanding, all the criticism.
Okay, I want you all to hold those thoughts for a few minutes, because we're going to come back in the last 5 minutes, and you'll get to talk about 2020 with your bold prescience, and then we'll come back here in December 2020, and we'll see. So we're coming back to this, and I'm giving you some warning that you've got to, be smart and you'll be held to account. In the meantime, I want to just ask one technical question and go back to USMCA. I guess it's not technical. We began speaking about it before, and that's Congress and the role and the process that goes forward there. I want to go to the audience for a couple of questions, and we'll come back to that. Luiza, Congress is the next step, I guess. We heard the ambassador say before that he's happy they put in progressive elements because now they have something for the Democrats in Congress, et cetera. I don't know if Trump wants to negotiate with new Congress. Just walk us again through this process, including, for those of us who aren't exceptionally schooled in this, there's a lame duck Congress for a while. What does it do, if anything? Does this wait till the new Congress? And how does that play out?
So as far as I know, the lame duck Congress, meaning the Congress between now and January, is not going to do anything on the new agreement, that there's a lot of technical steps that have to happen before it can go to Congress. So as far as everyone we've ever talked to in Washington is concerned, this is an issue for the new Congress. It means it's an issue for Democratic leadership in the House. And you would think, oh great, the Democrats love Canada, they love Trudeau, they'll do this, right? And it's not going to be that
Canadians
easy.
love Democrats. I don't know if
So,
Democrats love
you
Canada.
would just think they'll just get it done. There are a couple of factors. If you go back to the TPP, back when Republicans were still in a free trade, pro-trade mood, they didn't even bring that agreement to a vote. Why? Because they didn't want to give President Obama a win. So you can very easily see that same motivation for Democrats. Now, they may try to improve the agreement by pressing for more enforceability on labor standards or whatever. That's one option. You're now seeing Republicans criticizing the agreement on a variety of fronts. The fact is, all these people want to have their cake at the can. They want to be wooed. They want to be, cajoled. They want to be bought. They want some reason. Look, here's something the president wants. What's he going to give me for it? So let me criticize it up front so then we can have a conversation. So that's the starting point. Then the second question is, okay, is it something within the agreement that will have to be improved to win them over? Or is there something completely outside the agreement that they want and are willing to barter for? And then number three, this whole issue of the Mueller investigation, of oversight hearings, once the Democrats sort of sink their claws into this administration, how ugly will it get? How much room will there be for any kind of bipartisan cooperation? I think there are just a huge number of questions about this. It could go well or it could go very poorly. It could be punted down the line. So when you hear the president saying, well, we're just going to give notice that we're pulling out, that's not his effort to rip up the deal. That is his effort to say, look, if you don't pass it, there will be nothing. So that's his effort to try to prod them.
Is there a chance that there will be nothing? Can NAFTA get revoked and then this deal fail? Is that possible?
So and David McNaughton referred to this, there are huge legal issues inside the United States. The president can certainly give notice of his intention to withdraw, but there's a strong body of opinion that says Congress itself must revoke the enabling legislation. Now, Canadians will not really have a role in this. The bigger picture is if this debate gets very ugly as it goes forward, and there are all kinds of side negotiations, clearly for Canadians what this does is create economic uncertainty. That's what we hoped we had put behind us at the end of September and again on Friday. So if we see unraveling and arguments and an inability to work together across the aisle. And Trump, let's face it, he is not skilled in building a coalition in Congress. This is not Lyndon Johnson, who knows how to put together a coalition to get what he wants. We can feel the pinch of economic uncertainty, and the business community struggles about where it makes its 5-year investments. That's the real risk for this country.
I'm not sure that we'll see the way this goes down in Congress breaking entirely across party lines. Partially because I think Democrats would like to do two things. They'd like to leave the heavy lift of dealing with this to Republicans, because there isn't certainty amongst Republicans about where to stand on this. Republicans from states that are being hit by these tariffs are very critical of the president. And secondly, I'm not sure, given the choices that Democrats have to make in the new Congress, between the Democrats who have been elected who are really progressive, between those who think that job number one is Mueller and subpoenas and things like that, I'm not sure this is the hill that a lot of Democrats want to die on. To many Americans, to many Canadians, this is very, very important. To many Americans, this is a complicated trade deal that they don't really understand.
The only thing we get to say for sure, Ambassador McNaughton gets not 1 minute of free time over the next 8 months. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think the U.S. labor unions will have a lot to say as well, because I think the Democrats will be listening to what they have to say.
But they did throw their support behind the steel tariffs. So the labor unions are a little confused as to who they're rooting for on this one.
Yeah, I guess as a former journalist who actually stayed on the Canadian side of the border. I've got to worry about investment. I've got to worry, the uncertainty has already been created. The 232s still exist. Aluminum and steel are still a shot that exists across the bow. And I just wonder if I were going to be making an investment decision, on Canada's argument on investment for 30 years has been, hey, you can come in Canada, good place to operate, total access to the United States. Seems pretty arbitrary now.
Yeah, that's
whatever happens.
I mean, that's exactly the point that Brian Tobin brought up, right? And the uncertainty has already exacted a toll in this country, frankly. But here's the good news, all right? Because there's always,
obviously
there's always good news. This is probably a 6 to 9 month fight. It's not, we're not talking about 2 or 3 years of uncertainty. It's a very limited period of time, actually. So we just hang on through the turbulence.
Except that Donald Trump is doctrinaire about very little in life, except this. He's had a very, very long, he's got a 30-year history about railing against free trade. Not from a particularly informed position, but it is consistent. Yeah. He's switched positions on almost everything else, except this.
Okay.
I would say, like, if there's, sorry, if I could just add one thing. If there is a competitive advantage for Canada that is Trump imposed, it would be around immigration. It's one thing that we've been following really closely. It's not just limiting refugees, making it almost impossible for anyone to get an H-1B visa to come in as a skilled worker. But now they're cracking down on the spouses of H-1B holders. They're cracking down on foreign students, making it really, really hard for them to operate in the United States. If you're a company that needs to be bringing people in and out from around the world, I mean, Canada has a really good story to tell on that, and that's something they could really...
Just on Luiza's point, we've seen a sea change in the universities in this country. Our capacity to attract really brilliant foreign students who probably would have gone to the United States, but are choosing, they're not even applying. Yep. It's not a congenial environment for them, and they are now choosing Canadian universities as their first choice.
We looked at
okay, I'm going to go to a couple audience questions here, okay? We will leave the first one to last. And does the rise of populism in the U.S. provide any lessons for domestic politics in Canada? Or let me put it, what lessons does it provide for Canada,
do it.
if any?
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Don't do it. Okay.
Long-term bad. For a country that has a negative replacement rate, like every modern country does, just bad. To Lisa's point, the immigration thing is the most dangerous. That's the one that you can't afford to do. They wanted, forget the caravans of hordes of savages who were coming to the southern border, or however the president describes it. Stephen Miller, his immigration advisor, wants to limit legal immigration. These things that they're doing with H-1Bs.
How are we not going to do it?
How are we not going to do it? Well, here's really, and I agree with Luiza and Ali, we have a strong suit here. We are a high immigration receiving country. We take about 1%. We've done it. We're good at it. There's a good record here. And we have to continue to do that and more if we're going to, avoid the productivity challenges that are down the road. I would add a second issue, though. I think one of the ways and it's a really tough road to walk. I don't have an answer to this. We all want more diverse leaderships. We want to be inclusive as we can. But one of the things that happens in that conversation is there isn't a whole of country conversation anymore. And that's what, to some degree, creates this feeling of being left out, being sidelined, not being part. So I think our political leadership has to be careful about that. It's got to do something that's really tricky. It's got to be inclusive and welcoming, but it's also got to talk to Canadians in a way that makes them feel we are all part of a shared community. That's where I think the United States went down a road that has not been helpful.
I'm going to be a little more cynical about it, and I'm going to say that on the immigration issue, yes, Canada has this skills-based immigration system that is oftentimes proposed in the United States and considered too right-wing and draconian, frankly. But the real distinction that Canada has is that traditionally, it has controlled its border. It has not had an issue of large numbers of unauthorized people crossing the border the way the United States has. I think you said, what should we do about populism? I would say don't underestimate it. I think the fact that now you're having stories of people coming in and crossing the border, it's getting the same kind of reaction that it gets in the United States. And I think that is not a small thing, and it's something to watch and be careful about.
Every state has to control its own borders, and citizens become uncomfortable when states don't control those borders.
And you don't want to undermine a system that brings us two of our three panelists born in other countries and came to Canada as children, right?
No.
That's right. So, okay, there's a question about the WTO. I just want to, the last part of it, is there a future for the WTO? But I suppose also, there's some discussion. There was a meeting of non-China, non-US WTO countries in Canada a few weeks ago. There's some talk about the G9, which is exclusive of those two countries, and if they can lead some sort of movement. Is there a future for the WTO? Is there a leadership position for the WTO?
Well, let me just start. We have good reason to worry about the WTO. The WTO took us 35 years to get there, and if our trade agreements for the United States go south, that's our default position. So we care, Canadians care about the WTO. What's happening right now is the Trump administration is refusing to appoint arbitrators to their panels, and we are down to one judge. So by the end of next year, it's entirely conceivable that no trade dispute, and we have just launched one with respect to the tariffs, no arbitration panel will be able to function. There will not be a quorum of judges. Second, and that's a big issue, it's a big, just practical issue that's coming right at us. The second issue is the one you mentioned, Luiza. China joined the WTO, and there was an expectation China would follow the rules. There's a pretty deep consensus across Europe and North America that those rules didn't work the way people expected them to work, and there's a loss of confidence in the WTO. That's why that meeting was held in Ottawa, because we both need the WTO, but the WTO needs reform. There's no question.
Okay, I'm going back to US politics. Before you get to the holiday reading list, which so all think up your book. Everybody wants to read the book that you're going to read, which is a great compliment to the panel.
Lord.
So, what are the fault lines going to be, do you think, in the 2020 election in the U.S.? We saw in 2016 culture, economic anxiety, issues like that rise up very strongly. Where do you, and we're now into what, the second longest economic expansion in history. Maybe it can last through November 2020. That would make it the longest ever, wouldn't it? So,
I doubt it.
So given that you doubt it,
Yeah.
how does that affect, what are the terms of the debate that we're debating in 2020?
Well, interesting, in the week that we're remembering George H.W. Bush, if one, at the time of his election or his defeat into his second term, would have been able to look forward at his contribution to global stability and peace and the reunification of Germany and the strengthening of NATO, probably would have won another election. If one could have looked 2 years forward and said, we're in a recession now, but he broke his promise about taxes, and he's actually implemented a budget and fiscal policy that will be beneficial, which Bill Clinton got to enjoy and take some credit for, you would have voted for George H.W. Bush again. But in the end, we are not likely to be in an economic position that is as strong, meaning the United States, in the next election as we are today, in some fashion. Markets will come down a little bit because we've got interest rates understandably rising. The Fed chair says we're probably getting to where we have to be on interest rates, but that's going to be an issue. If things slow down, remember that healthcare was the number one issue in this, not by a country mile, but in this last election. Healthcare is fundamentally an economic issue. If you got money, then healthcare is not a problem to you if you can buy insurance. As these economic questions become bigger, it's going to dominate more of the conversation. Again, the 3.7% unemployment is misleading on a few levels, largely because wages have been stuck for a while, and we've seen some increases, but largely because they're not representative of what you and I used to talk about as low unemployment. It's a different kind of employment. It's a different kind of ladder. So I think that continues to be the main problem in America, that the prosperity is not shared. And that is going to ultimately, I think, be the tenor of the next presidential election.
Next presidential election. What is, if you want to weave into here, because I'm going to ask anyhow who you think the Democrat nominee will be, or how they will tear themselves apart on the way there, that might influence the terms of what the debate is in the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are any number of people you could imagine running for the Democrats, and the one I'm most interested in is when does Nikki Haley run for the Republicans? I'm really interested to see that. I think in terms of what the election will be fought on, look, the Democrats learned from these midterms that healthcare is a strong issue for them. So I would expect them to make, they sort of pivoted toward the end, and rather than making their ads about Trump, they kind of focused on healthcare, and that really worked for them. For the Republicans, I think it just depends on the state of the economy. And they can't run on another massive tax cut, but they'll probably run on making whatever was temporary, the individual tax cuts and so on in the last tax bill, making it permanent. There'll probably be some further pressure on that. But if the economy is doing really poorly and they don't want to talk about it, they'll be focused on social issues and the sort of my team versus your team in the culture wars, I think.
Janice, who's going to be having this conversation? Is it going to be a modern George McGovern or a modern Bill Clinton?
To take a step back from that one, let me just say, if we think about a recession, which comes, that's part of life, and cycles don't last forever. The democratic world is much less well positioned to deal with a recession than we have been in the past. Many countries are running significant deficits, and if you layer that over that we don't really have the kind of economic and social tools that we would normally have because of the Great Recession, and that you have this anger and this sense of being left out of the shared prosperity, that can create a very ugly election. So a lot will depend on what happens with the U.S. economy in the next 12 months.
Well, you have been erudite about that, but the audience wants to know, and it's right there in the question from Anonymous. Can each of the panels predict the next presidential election? Who should the Dems run? Who does Canada want in the White House? Who's going to win? Well, let's start with who should the Dems run, who's going to win, and who does Canada want to win?
I would say
three words.
Let me start with who Canada should want to win. If such a candidate existed, and I'm not saying it should, they would want a successful candidate from Ohio, right? Somebody who doesn't have a benign view of Canada.
Senator Brown?
People talk about Sherrod Brown. I'm not sure that's it, because the problem is Sherrod Brown goes into the same bucket as John Kasich, as Jeb Bush, as John Huntsman. On paper, fantastic candidates. America's gotten perverse in its politics, right? These on paper great candidates, I don't know that we're going to live long enough to see that work again. If it does, that's great for the world and for politics. But I think either we're going to need a big personality to go up against Donald Trump in that fashion, and none of those people I named are that, or you're going to need the exact opposite, somebody who everybody says, oh, you're going to keep things going. So I don't know who it is, but Canada wants somebody who understands trade, who understands Canada's good neighborliness, who understands, by the way, the reason I said Ohio is because Ohio has often had a governor who's not of the same party as the legislature, so they understand bipartisanship. Those are all the kinds of things that Canada wants in a president.
Ohio.
Well, I think Canada wants a good financial manager, right? Like the whole idea that if America sneezes, Canada catches a cold.
Good point.
I think that's really important, and I think having sort of an incrementalist is better for Canada than having someone who comes in as a disruptor and turns everything upside down. Because you can see Canadian policy kind of with a lag adapting itself to U.S. policy over and over again. I think you want somebody who isn't going to come in and just rip everything else out, root and branch. In terms of the slate that's out there, it ranges from, is it going to be Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, or Elizabeth Warren. I mean, I don't know. It's still early days. I think it's going to be fascinating
Lots
to
of candidates
watch
in the
it.
early field, I guess. Janice?
Yeah, you know, with respect to candidates, my biggest worry is they're going to tear each other apart.
Well, it's a danger that the Republicans had for 2 full cycles, right?
Yeah.
Where they had so many candidates, and by the end of it, there were
Nobody was-
whoever won limped into the election.
And nobody was left standing.
And so that's the danger that Democrats have. There's no sign of narrowing. Now, again, it's 2 years out, so I suppose that's okay. But at some point, it does need to look a little bit like we have to be able to give a better answer to this, and we're just not in a place where we can.
So, you know, I hope we get somebody from the Midwest with Midwest solidity, good financial manager, can reach out, can bridge the divides. You know, John Kasich looked to me like a great candidate.
Looked
2
to everybody
years
like a
ago.
great candidate. That's
I
the
was
problem.
wrong. I was wrong.
Okay, so here's your last question. It's the book question. Somebody said early, what books are on your holiday must-read list? Now they've gone to really, though, which
What?
book should we read? So I don't think it could be a new book. It could be, I suppose, an old book. What do you think people should read?
Well, I read fiction because the worse the world gets, the better fiction is. That's what I read. I read a tremendous amount of fiction. So I just read so I'll just tell you what I read and loved last year. So for Canadians in the room, I read Michael Redhill's Bellevue Square. And that's actually a wonderful book because it takes us in a funny way into this new world that we're going into. Who's yourself, right? And how do we think about technology and what that's going to do? But it's just beautifully written. And then I'm reading a really wonderful book by a German writer. I can tell you the title and I'll text you the author in a minute, okay? But it's called All for Nothing. And it's a New York Review of Books reissue. It is just superb. It begins in January 1945 and follows a family. And the title of the book is All for Nothing. And it is sober. That is a superb novel.
Luiza?
Sure. So I'm a total cliche. I went to see Hamilton this summer and fell in love with it and loved it. So I got the Ron Chernow biography, and I have to say it was the best thing I've read in a really long time. I just could not put it down, and it was so interesting, not only because it sort of dramatized the American founding and these incredible personality clashes, but number one, it made me feel much, much better about the coarseness and awfulness of today's social media. I mean, these guys were doing just like worse, except they were doing it in pamphlets
Right.
instead of on Twitter and Facebook, and somehow the Republic survived. So I felt very good about that. It was just fascinating how many of the issues that they were dealing with continue to be such an undercurrent of American politics. I mean, dealing with the South, dealing with slavery. I mean, so much of this, you can just see it in today's politics. And to me, it just sort of made me think about how, you know, the French-English-Quebec issue has been such an undercurrent in Canadian politics since the beginning. We never, I don't think in the US, quite talk about the Southern issue quite the same way, but I think it really is comparable, and it really comes through in this book, the way from the very beginning they were making compromises to keep the South on board on this or on that, and how a lot of this continues to this day. I loved the book. I loved everything about it, and now I have to make my way through the biographies of all the other founding fathers. But that one, it also made me hate Thomas Jefferson, I have to say. He comes off as a total ass in this book.
All right.
So I've got 2, one old and one new, because I'm sort of really into this issue of why we're having these culture wars we're having and the weaponization. One of them is by Arlie Hochschild from Berkeley, and it's called Strangers in Their Own Land, where she sort of went and lived with people in the bayou and really tried to understand why they were so different from her and why everything she was they hated. And one of the lessons in there is that in order to have a constructive dialogue with people in your own country who see things so differently than you do, you have to be able to turn off your alarms to have a conversation. So it's very inspirational in terms of how to conduct dialogue in the time that we're in. The other one is new, and I don't necessarily agree with everything he's written, but Anand Giridharadas's book, Winners Take All.
Oh, I hated that.
Well, there are times I go through it, and there are parts about it that I don't like, but it's provocative, and his point largely is that America is not the country it presents itself as, and until Americans come to terms with that, we're going to have the problems that we have. We are just not, the things that are written about America and the things that are at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty and the things that we say we are most definitely not. And that's something that Americans have to think about. So both of these books are helping me through understanding why everybody's so angry in a world where the statistics indicate we should be happier than we are.
Right. In an old book category, I reread over the last year Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is one of the best titles of a book I can think of, and he basically, among other things in the book, I think it talks about distraction and how people become distracted and detached in some ways, and he pits, if you recall from the book, and I know you've read it, he pits an Orwellian world against a Aldous Huxley world, and says, whereas Orwell thought that we would succumb to authorities banning books, Huxley thought that we would be drowned in a sea of trivia and totally distracted from our civil engagement in any way. I think Huxley's winning for our current, at least in the democracies, malaise. And anyhow, it's sobering to think he was writing that and writing it, the detachment from the word and how the word creates nuance. So I recommend that as well. I want to thank you all. It was delightful to get reacquainted and terrific of you to share, come up here, not just up here, but up to Ottawa and share your thoughts and perspectives. And we'll be holding you to account, as I said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating panel. We were talking over dinner, and I asked Ali if he's ever capable to disconnect. And he said, yeah, usually on the 4th day of a vacation. And then his partner reminded me that their last vacation was 3 days. Thank you very much for our partners and our sponsors that made this evening possible. About 15 years ago, this dinner was begun with a partnership between the Public Policy Forum and Treasury Board Services in terms of important insights to the public service. And we're really delighted to have so many government partners with us this evening. And obviously on the file of Canada-US relations, I think it's important to pay tribute to so many of them, whether it's immigration, ESDC, and global affairs that are working behind the scenes on a lot of these important negotiations, and often their work goes unnoticed and uncelebrated. So a big thank you to them. Also like to thank our presenting partner, BMO, and thank you very much for having Mr. Tobin with us this evening. National PR, delighted to have Andrew Molson and his team in Ottawa, Christian and Howard, who have been fantastic support, and of course to the Hill Times for their support as well. Just a reminder, April 11th is the Public Policy Forum's Growth Summit and Testimonial Dinner in Toronto. Tickets are already selling fast and do sell out, so please be sure to reserve your time for that. A huge thank you to the PPF team, our comms team, Kelly and Husfini, who led for the preparation of this evening. A big thanks for all the work that you do to make evenings like this possible. And I don't know, as many of you, I spent many times throughout the day reading anecdotes and stories and letters from George H.W. Bush. And one of the things that his foundation highlighted, the Points of Light Foundation, was in his honor to give back by a day of service. And I thought I'd leave you with that this evening. And thank you very much for coming.